Hello and welcome to Disruption of Attachment, the third part of the attachment series in the Unit 1 Psychology Revision AS level AQA, etc. etc.
Yes.
So stop asking what the exam board is, even though, it's very nice that you commented. Thank you. Right. Deprivation occurs when a child has formed an important attachment but is separated from the major attachment figure. This could be if the parent dies or divorced. Privation is where no attachment has been formed. The most common is when the child has been institutionalized or in an orphanage. Very rarely you have feral children, but we'll go on to that. Right. Kicking off, we're going to go with
Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis.
Bowlby believed that emotional care was important for development as important for development as physical care. Bowlby argued that breaking the paternal bond with a child during the early years was likely to have serious effects on the intellectual, social and emotional development. He argued that a child would have difficulty forming relationships with other people and would be at risk to developing behavioural disorders. He claimed these effects were irreversible and permanent, and they would occur if separation would become if this happened before the age of about 2.5 years, but there is still a risk up until about 5 years old.
Yeah.
So, doing a little evaluation of the
maternal deprivation hypothesis is...
The main thing you really need to know is that the study of 44 thieves. This is where there are 88 people, aged 5 to 16. 44 of them were thieves and 44 of them were...
non-thieves.
Yeah, they were controls.
Group.
Bowlby identified 14 of these thieves that were affectionless psychopaths.
Because they appeared to have no guilt for what they'd done.
No guilt or remorse. Bowlby interviewed the children and their families and built up a picture of their early life experience. He found that 86% of those thieves diagnosed as affectionless psychopaths had experienced frequently early separations. Very few of the non-psychopath thieves, only 17%, had experienced a frequent early separation, and none of the controls. So that's 86% for the psychopaths, 17% for the non-psychopath thieves, and none of the controls had experienced separation at a young age. This led Bowlby to conclude that early separation affected later emotional development. But there were criticisms of Bowlby's 44 thieves research. That's right, a criticism of a criticism. That's like a strength.
Crazy.
The data on separation was collected retrospectively and may not be reliable. Bowlby himself diagnosed the affectionate psychopaths, and so he could have been biased. I'd like to point out that the 44 thieves was actually a strength, not criticism, so it's a criticism of a strength.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. I made a boo-boo. Right. Another strength is that Bowlby's theory has important applications. It gave rise to a positive change in infant care. For example, the theory led to orphanage care being improved, to take into account emotional needs, including trying to keep children in one foster home. Also, provisions were made for parents to stay in hospital with their young children, and longer visiting hours were allowed. It's always good. A weakness is an experiment by Rutter, you don't really need to know that claims that Bowlby confused cause and effect. It may be due to factors associated with deprivation. For example, hospitalisation may be because of poor living conditions, and divorce may be stress surrounding the divorce is what is the problem rather than the separation
itself,
etc. To test this, there was a study, the Isle of Wight study. Over 2,000 boys between the age of 9 and 11 were interviewed, and so were their families. It was found that if separation was due to physical illness or death of the mother, then there was no correlation with delinquency. If the separation was due to psychiatric illness or discord with the family, then the boys were 4 times more likely to become delinquent. This suggests that that it is mainly family discord rather than maternal separation, as such, that causes difficulties in maladjustment. So it's more, if you like, arguments with the family rather than deprivation from the family members.
Yes.
That causes troubled people and behavioural problems. Another criticism was that Bowlby modelled together various kinds of separation, like where a bond had formed but it was disrupted, and privation, where an attachment had never formed. Rutter, this dude, argues that the effects of privations are much more severe and long-lasting than deprivation. And one last point, which is a really good point. is that Bobby's work has been criticised as it suggests that the time the research was done was just after the war, and that during the war women had assumed male jobs, and it suggested that maybe Bowlby's theories were to make women stay at home with their children to free up the workplace for the returning men. That's very, very controversial. Very controversial. Very, yes.
Very controversial.
Very controversial. Now, that's Deprivation. We're halfway through. Cheer.
Woo!
Yeah. Yes, so that's all very good. Bobby's work has been... Yes, there we go. That's it. I'm just checking.
Checking.
Right.
We're on to privation now.
Privation or privation.
Privation,
Just
however.
private, sort of on your
Privation.
own. Rather than privation sounds like a toilet. Privy.
Okay.
Right. Oh, you can have...
Whatever floats your boat.
Oh, my boat is floated. Right. So, the definition we've already said, where no attachment has been formed. Kick off with case studies, I think. Let's just go straight ahead with Jeannie. Jeannie spent most of her childhood locked in a room. During the day, she was strapped to a child's potty and was punished if she made any sound. She was found when she was 13 and a half years old. On discovery, she had the appearance of a 6 to 7-year-old, and she was described as unsocialised, primitive, and hardly human. She had made virtually no sounds and was hardly able to walk. She was given a considerable amount of educational and assistance once she was found, and her ability to perform tasks that did not require language improved rapidly. Unfortunately, Jeannie's language skills had failed to reach adult levels, and she developed a fairly large vocabulary, but she spoke in short, ungrammatical sentences and did not understand sentences that were complex grammatically. Her social skills remained limited, in part because her language was poor, but also seemed that she was uninterested in people. So that's... We'll evaluate that a bit later. And yeah, it's quite a sad story, but there we go. Another study studied identical twins that had spent most of their first 7 years of their lives locked in a cellar. They had been badly treated and often beaten. They were barely able to talk and relied mainly on gestures rather than speech. The twins were fostered at age 9 by a pair of loving sisters, and by the time they were 14, their behaviour was essentially normal. By the age of 20, they were above average intelligence and had excellent relationships. So that's a nice story.
Nice story. Good outcome.
Yes. Evaluation of case studies. Case studies of children who have been raised in isolated and deprived circumstances show two things. Some children have never recovered from early privation, and other children have showed remarkable recovery, as we've just shown by the two examples.
Yes.
Generally, the effects of privation can be reversed, suggesting that children are more resilient than Bobby assumed. Jeannie had spent much longer in isolation, though, and might be beyond the age of recovery, which might be an example of why Jeannie hadn't recovered. Yeah. And also, she was disrupted later on. I think it says it here. The case studies... Oh, no, this is just another point. Case studies are very small samples. It's probably not reasonable to generalise from them. It's possible that some of these children were abnormal from birth. Jeannie's father thought she was retarded, and this is why she locked her away, which is quite sad.
It's harsh.
Another point, which it doesn't say here, but it should say, to do with the Czech twins, is that... The twins might have been attached to each other, which, because there were two of them. But the twins might have been attached to each other. They were adopted to a loving family, whereas Jeannie was studied by scientists and then fought over in courts. Everywhere. Yeah, and Jeannie was older, and they're the main points. Older, they might have been attached to each other, and then what happened after is completely different. Right, so that's a little bit of privation, but the main bit is, of course...
Institutionalization.
Which is roughly... Orphanages.
Orphanages.
Basically being in care. Okay. So, Tizard and Hodges is the key name. And by the way, if you have to discuss any studies into privation, discuss this one, because this is the big one, I'd say.
Get most marks for it.
So, it's a longitudinal study, so that means it goes on a bit. That follows 65 children that had been taken into care before they were 4 months old. They had an average of 50 caregivers by the time they were 4 years old, and in spite of this, children had a mean IQ of 105 at the age of 4.5. Thus, maternal deprivation did not hold back the children's cognitive ability. By the age of 4, 24 had been adopted, 15 had been returned home, known as restored, with their biological parents, and the rest had remained institutionalised. Children were assessed at the age of 4, 8 and 16. The findings were that at 8, most of the restored and adopted had formed close relationships with their parents. and the new parents, and the children's teachers reported them as being more attention-seeking and more over-friendly than peers. They tended to be unpopular, but were not below their normal peers cognitively. So that shows that at 8, restored and adopted had a close relationship with their parents, but they were a bit unpopular at school. At 16, it was found that most of the adopted children had formed close relationships with their adopted parents as close as controls, whereas the restored group were less likely to be closely attached, despite the adopted group doing better at home. Both experienced problems at school. They were less likely than other children to have a special friend or regard other adolescents as a source of emotional support, and were more likely to be quarrelsome or bullies. So again, the problems at school maintained the whole time, but at 16, adopted children had formed closer relationships than the restored children. The conclusions this draws is that children suffered long-term consequences of their early privation, but some of the effects can be overcome by subsequent attachments. It suggested that perhaps the adopted group got on better at home because of special effort was put in, but no effort was put in at school to make similar relationships, if that makes sense.
You can't really make special relationships at school because there's so many kids.
Yeah, so so what it's saying is it can be overcome with extra effort. The evaluation, but it is long-lasting privation. That's the last little point. The evaluation of this last little bit is one of the problems with longitudinal studies is that people drop out. This is called attrition. It's likely that particular types of people were the ones that dropped out, and in this case, it's possible that the more troubled children dropped out, so they didn't have to continue.
Studied.
Yeah. So that shows bias, obviously. Another weakness is that this is a natural experiment, and so we can't infer
Cause and effect.
Cause and effect like a pro. It's possible that children selected for adoption were more attractive and socially able, and so they were easier to get on with, and just generally easier to get on with at home. But the temperament hypothesis suggests easier children should have easier relationships with everyone, and they still didn't get on that well at school. But another strength is that compared to case studies, the sample size is larger, which is always good. Finally, there are many uncontrolled variables. Institutional care involves more than just paternal deprivation, such as children often suffer many other forms of deprivation, like poor diet, lack of stimulation. Therefore, it's difficult to isolate the effects of breaking the paternal bond.
Yeah.
And that's about it. And also another thing is that institutionalized children do not experience total privation because they have peer support. They have each other, really.
Yeah, have all the other kids in the orphanage or care home.
Yeah, so there we are. And institutional care can involve more than just emotional deprivation. We may be confusing deprivation from physical care and lack of attachments. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Good. Right, that's everything I said, really. Children more resilient than Bowlby suggests. This is the evaluation of privation in general. Children are more resilient than Bowlby suggested. The effects are not permanent, particularly if caught early. Very small samples may not be able to generalise, but Tizard's research does overcome this somewhat and provide some better support for Bowlby's theory. And the key findings seem to be that privation is a vulnerability factor. If suitable effort is put in, then the effects can be minimised.
Yeah.
Which is good, and I'm very glad that it can be. Thank you for listening to this
Thank
somewhat
you.
longer video, but enjoy our next one, which is daycare.
Yep.
I enjoy
and
daycare.
that's the last. Daycare is the last section.
Yes, this is the penultimate attachment video.
Dun.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.